We begin with breaking news from Brussels. I'm Lynda Kinkade, and Europe's most wanted man has been captured in a raid. Salah Abdelslam was a leading suspect in last November's terrorist attacks in Paris. He was injured during a shootout, and that led to his capture. Earlier in the day, Belgium officials revealed his fingerprints and DNA were found inside an apartment raided earlier in the week. Terrorist expert Sajjan Gohel joins me from London. He's the International Security Director for the Asia Pacific Foundation, an independent think tank. Thanks very much for being with us. Firstly, your reaction to the developments we've seen today.
This is a very significant development. Europe's most wanted terrorist, the man connected to the worst terrorist atrocity in Paris, has been captured. Importantly, the fact that he's alive, which means that he can be brought to justice, and also that he could potentially provide key intelligence to counterterrorism agencies as to the logistical patterns of ISIS in Europe, safe havens, other individuals that might be plotting activities. This is the first time that a senior operative of ISIS has been captured alive. Many of them were killed in drone strikes, others in terrorist operations. This is somebody who wasn't just a foot soldier, he was an operator, he was a planner. So this is very significant.
This was a key suspect from the Paris terror attacks. We know the rest were killed. His brother, we know, blew himself up. There was speculation that he got cold feet, and that's why he was one of the ones who survived.
That's potentially true. This is an individual who has kept himself alive, he's kept himself safe. It raises questions about what is taking place inside Belgium, the fact that this individual disappeared off the radar for several months, and yet many people thought he would flee to Raqqa, the de facto capital of ISIS in Syria. He seems to have stayed in Belgium. Does that mean that there is a very powerful network of ISIS supporters and sympathizers inside that country? Does it mean that he's also not just running from counterterrorism agencies, but from ISIS too? Has he fallen out with them? This is very embarrassing for ISIS that a senior figure of theirs has been captured. It'll be interesting to see how they spin this now. Will they want to try and glorify him? Will they try and discredit him? Ultimately, their concern now is that his capture could expose their cell structure in Europe.
Well, there was quite a few analysts that remarked that there's no way he would go to Syria after he fled following the Paris attacks. Do you think he's on the outer when it comes to the ISIS network?
It's possible, but keep in mind that Salah Abdelslam had traveled from Europe to Syria last year at some point. He even appeared in one of the ISIS magazines, Dabik, and was showing off to some extent about how he can move back into Europe and into Syria freely. This is an individual who isn't just connected to the Paris attacks, but a whole host of plots inside France and Belgium throughout 2015, starting with the Verviers cell in January of last year. He was connected to Al-Kazani, who carried out the attempted attack on board a train from Belgium to France. So Salah Abdelslam was very important. The fact is that he'd become Europe's most wanted terrorist, so potentially he was lying low. It would be very important to establish whether he has severed those links with ISIS because of a potential fallout, a dispute, the fact that he didn't kill himself like his brother, as ISIS expects from its followers. So there's a lot of questions, but critically, his capture now means that answers can potentially be provided.
And now the raid that we saw today, where he was captured alive, it happened in a neighbourhood called Molenbeek. We know it's had a history of links to extremists. Explain why.
Molenbeek, unfortunately, has developed a very bad reputation as being a safe haven for extremists. It's where a lot of the migrants from North Africa, from the Middle East have settled. We should point out that the overwhelming number of them are law-abiding. They are not involved in any terrorist activity, but within that, there is the invisible enemy that is able to disperse itself into the civilian fabric of society, that operates in the shadows, and that has been able to plot and plan activities. Whatever happens in places like Molenbeek in terms of ISIS operation impacts throughout Europe. It vibrates across countries, including in France. Plots in Molenbeek have been tied to activities in France, for example, and that needs to be identified more as to who are all the individuals there that are potentially providing safe haven. Not all of them may take part in terrorist activities, but they are giving refuge and sanctuary to people like Abdelslam, and that needs to be dissected more.
And also, as a whole, Belgium as a whole, it's provided more foreign fighters to ISIS than any other country. What needs to happen in that country?
It's very sobering that, on the one hand, Belgium is effectively the capital of the European Union, as it seems to also be the logistical capital of ISIS at the same time. That is something that is raising a lot of concerns. And it's something also that I think Belgium's own internal fabric of society is going to have to address. This is a country that often politically is internally divided. You have the Flemish speakers on one side, the French on the other. Politically, they seem to be disorganized. I think that disorganization has allowed terrorist groups to operate, to turn parts of Belgium into a breeding ground for extremism. So Belgium has to politically sort itself out in order to then provide better security for its people. Because what's happened just now is not a new event. It's part of a series of counter-terrorism operations that have been taking place ever since the Paris attacks.
And just finally, what do you make of these sort of neighborhoods like Molenbeek, where it allows people like Salah Abdelslam to hide and go undetected for so long?
Well, it's audacious and brazen of Abdelslam, the fact that he felt so confident that he could actually reside there without having to move. The fact that he's been the most wanted man in Europe since the Paris attacks, but at the same time, he did not seem to be deterred or intimidated. This is now an issue that would have to be looked at again, because the Belgian authorities, and we should bear in mind, they have done a lot of good work since the Paris attacks in dismantling cells, arresting individuals, foiling potential plots. But this is an uphill treadmill for the authorities. One plot means that another 5 are potentially being created. So this is something that needs to be looked at, and the logistical trails of terrorists in Europe, linking potentially Belgium and France and other countries, it needs to be identified, and potentially Abdelslam might be able to provide the answers.
Sajjan, Gohel, great to get your perspective on this. If you can stay with us as we continue to cover this developing story. We're going to go now to CNN producer Tim Lester, who joins me on the phone. He's in Cordoba, Spain. Tim, firstly, what do you make of the developments we've seen today?
Well, Lynda, it took them a long time, obviously. I think the surprise was that Salah Abdelslam was still in the Brussels area, because the trail seemed to go cold, and many speculated within the intelligence community that he'd already managed to reach Syria again. I think what it does show is that there are a number of safe houses in Belgium and probably elsewhere in Europe that ISIS and ISIS-affiliated groups are able to run. And it's taken a long time for the lines to be connected and for these raids to occur. So it's a victory, but it's taken a long time to get there.
The Belgian Justice Minister, according to Reuters, said, "We got him." There must be a lot of relief from Belgian authorities.
A great deal of relief, but it'll be tempered by the fact that another man involved in this Paris plot, Aboud, said apparently he boasted before he himself was shot dead in Paris that there were some 70 or 80 other ISIS figures in Europe. And it'll be tempered also by the fact that it's now quite evident that the massive refugee flows that occurred in 2015 were the perfect disguise for a number, we don't know how many, but a number of ISIS fighters trained in Syria and trained in Iraq to use those refugee migrant flows to get into Europe. And the ability with which they moved around once in Europe, across borders, ferries into Italy, Hungary, into Austria, countless different routes they used on their way to northern Europe. So the question will be, okay, Salah Abdelslam has been captured, but how many others might be out there, and where might the next plot be? Of course, the British have already said that they suspect that ISIS would like nothing better than to target London or another major British centre in the coming months.
And Salah Abdelslam, of course, is public enemy #1. He was Europe's most wanted until his capture today. Just remind our viewers the role he played in the Paris attacks.
I think that is still up for some questioning, actually, Lynda, because at the time of the attacks, he did not carry out an attack that was due to take place in the 18th arrondissement in Paris. And there was some speculation amongst French security services people that we spoke to at the time in Paris when we were covering the attacks about whether he had simply lost his nerve or something had gone wrong, perhaps with a suicide vest. There was a suicide vest that was later discovered discarded in the southern suburb of Paris. And so it's not quite clear whether he was meant to be one of those who carried out an attack. It does seem that was the original intention. But whatever happened, he left Paris late that night, went back to Brussels, was picked up by a friend who apparently had no idea of his role in the attacks, who dropped him off at a local railway station in Brussels, and Abdelslam turned to him and said, "You'll never see me again." So it's not entirely clear just how senior a member of this plot he was. It appears that others like Mohamed Abrini may have well been more of the logistics brains behind it, and Abdelslam was one of the operatives, if you like. But perhaps that'll become apparent a little clearer in the weeks and months to come.
Many analysts speculated that he had indeed chickened out and didn't go through with the suicide attack, and that ISIS might in fact be after him as much as European police.
ISIS might be what? Sorry, I missed the last bit.
Some analysts have speculated that he might be on the outer when it comes to ISIS, given they put out their propaganda video after the Paris attacks, and he was absent. He wasn't in it as one of their so-called heroes. So do you think he was on the outer when it came to ISIS, given the fact that he didn't go through with his suicide attack?
I think it's quite possible. I just don't think we know whether he was meant to die that night, whether he was meant to carry out an attack. All the indications are that he should have done, but we don't know that for sure. He certainly appeared on the way back to Brussels, according to the two men that he was driving with back to Brussels that night. He was quiet, somewhat nervous, somewhat tense, as if something had gone wrong, as if this was not how it was planned to be. So whether he decided that the safest thing for him to do was to go to ground in Brussels and use the network of associates that he clearly had in the Brussels area to lie low, rather than try to get back to Syria and perhaps an uncertain reception from his ISIS superiors, I don't think we're going to know that until he's questioned, and he may not actually reveal what his role was meant to be. But I think it's quite possible that he wasn't meant to leave Paris alive that night, yes.
You mentioned earlier how long it took authorities to actually track him down, to capture him today. There must be some frustrations in Europe about intelligence sharing.
I think there's a great deal of frustration. I think that's been one of the biggest weaknesses. In fact, both the Belgians and the French have acknowledged to us in the past that it's something they haven't got right yet. Intelligence agencies, by nature, are very jealous of the information they hold. They're not good sharers of information. They don't necessarily trust each other, even within the European Union. Combine that reluctance to share with the fact that you have open borders in much of the European Union, and you've got quite a job on your hand against a very sophisticated terrorist organization that is quite capable of putting people into Europe. So this is the biggest problem Europe faces in terms of security. It's cooperation amongst agencies, not just across borders, but within borders. The French security services, the domestic and the foreign, have been notorious for their silo mentality. The Belgians, as your previous interviewee mentioned, have been not very well organized because of the regional divisions within Belgium. Other countries have multiple agencies that all have some sort of role in intelligence. And again, you don't have a very effective central database. So these are all problems that are being addressed, but are they being addressed fast enough? I think we'll only find out when the next attempt is either foiled or is successfully carried out, Lynda.
And Tim, why do you think that amongst all the countries in the world, Belgium actually has more people joining ISIS, more fighters joining their cause?
Well, per capita, it is true out of all the European countries that Belgium has more fighters that have gone to Syria and Iraq. And I think there's a lot of reasons that have been identified by people who study this in great depth. Belgium is full of towns which are suffering some sort of post-industrial decline, if you like, and a lot of those towns have high immigrant populations, and the second or third generation of those immigrants have felt alienated, marginalized, neglected. There are very few opportunities. On top of that, you've got a number of radical mosques, a number of militant imams who've encouraged this. There was an organization called Sharia for Belgium that was very influential in recruiting and sending overseas young militants. So you have an infrastructure there for terrorist groups that ISIS has latched onto when it has received in Syria and Iraq a great number of Belgian and indeed French fighters. So Belgium has a number of those problems. It has a large immigrant community, specifically from Morocco, but not exclusively, from Algeria to a great extent. It's also been a magnet for others who've come from elsewhere in Europe and ended up in Belgium, in places like Molenbeek, from as far afield as Spain, for example. So it's had this reputation as almost as a magnet for jihadists from all over Europe because it's had such a thriving jihadist scene, a thriving militant scene. So I think it's a problem that the Belgians are now more than aware of after the raid in Verbier last year that rounded up a large cell. And so one would hope that they're going to start getting to grips with this now a little more with a more determination. I think there are signs of that already, Lynda.
Okay, Tim Lester, great to have your analysis on this developing story. Tim Lester on the phone from Spain. Thank you very much. I want to go back now to our terrorism expert, Sanjay Gohel. He joins me from London again. He's the International Security Director for the Asia Pacific Foundation, which is an independent think tank. I was just speaking there with Tim about whether or not Salah Abdelslam is on the outer when it comes to the ISIS network as a result of not following through on the suicide attack during the Paris events. What do you make? What do you think of it?
Well, there's a lot of speculation and conjecture. Ultimately, we will potentially now know the truth that Abdelslam has been captured. He is a key cog in the Paris attacks. There is some dispute as to what specifically his role entailed, but he certainly was aware of it, and he was definitely pulling a lot of the strings, just as he was with some of the other plots that he was connected to in France and Belgium last year, starting with the Verbier cell in Belgium in January of 2015. Then he was connected to the train plot involving El Kazani, who had been tasked to shoot people on a train from Belgium to France. And there were other plots that the French authorities had disrupted. It's only the Paris attacks that brought Abdelslam to public attention. But this was an individual who was very much working behind the scenes in a lot of different activities. Did he chicken out from the Paris attacks? We'll only now know probably the truth.
And during these raids, we've seen the raid earlier this week that there was obviously one person shot dead. We believe Abdelslam escaped along with one other person. And today there was another person taken into custody. What do you think in terms of the networks that exist out there, particularly in these areas of Molenbeek in particular, a neighbourhood known to be a hotbed for extremist ideology? Do you think there are big networks out there within and around Brussels?
I'm afraid there are very large, significant, elaborate networks belonging to ISIS in Belgium. It is their logistical capital inside Europe. They have used Belgium as a base not just to recruit and radicalize foreign fighters, to assist them in Syria and Iraq, but also to use Belgium as a base of operations to carry out plots in France, in Belgium. And it's important to identify the fact that virtually all the big ISIS terrorist-related activities last year, most of them emanated out of Belgium itself. Molenbeek was identified as a key breeding ground for ISIS fighters, but there are also other parts of Brussels and the suburbs as well. And it's a sobering thought, the fact that Brussels is also the home of so many European Union institutions on the one side, and it's also, unfortunately, being tarred with being the center for ISIS activities as well.
Going forward, now that there are absolutely so many migrants, particularly a lot of people fleeing from Syria and moving, you know, possibly to places like Molenbeek, what will authorities need to do going forward to make sure that more people don't become radicalized?
Keep in mind that a lot of the people that join ISIS join them because they see this group projecting power, control, influence. And sometimes there's also a lot of naivety as to what ISIS are about. No one really spends enough time reading the small print. This is a group that claims to represent a faith, whereas in reality they end up killing more Muslims than they kill anybody else, and doesn't get enough attention. But every day ISIS are killing ordinary Muslims, and more people need to be aware of that, because they would probably think twice in case they wanted to join. Unfortunately, there are some, like Abdelslam, who are motivated by a propensity to violence, who want to inflict a significant amount of pain on others. Those type of individuals, you can never stop from getting radicalized. There's no way of turning them back. It's the more naive and impressionable ones that could potentially be thwarted in joining this group. But this is a huge challenge now for the authorities. And we need to keep in mind that a separation should be drawn between those migrants that are fleeing persecution from ISIS in Syria and also from the Assad regime, and those that are deliberately joining ISIS with the intention to create harm on others.
And just going forward, what do European intelligence agencies need to do to share their information and to improve the efficiency of the way they work?
This is one of the key questions, because this is well over 12 years since the 9/11 attacks. They've been talking about better cooperation, intelligence sharing, pulling resources together since then, and it's not really happened. As your previous speaker was talking about, that many intelligence agencies are very jealously guarding their information, but each agency has a piece of the puzzle that, if put together, forms a wider picture of terrorist networks inside Europe. More cooperation is going to be required, because the capture of Abdelslam doesn't end ISIS's activities in Europe. It's potentially only going to unravel the beginning of what could be a much wider network than we expected, and therefore cooperation is essential in order to disrupt plots, dismantle networks, and potentially also stop individuals from being radicalized and recruited in the future. This is an uphill treadmill for the authorities.
Really great to have your perspective on all of this. We thank you so much for being with us today. And we will continue coverage of this story, our breaking news coverage that public enemy number one, Europe's most wanted man, has been captured in Brussels. And our breaking news coverage will continue just ahead with Hala Gourani in London.
This is CNN Breaking News.